I didn't plan to fall in love that day. Our eyes met for just a moment, in the middle of an ordinary, difficult life, and something inside me quietly shifted. I tried to ignore it, to stay practical, to keep my distance, but that single glance followed me everywhere. I had no idea then that one brief moment would change the rest of my life. Hello, my name is Oscar. I'm 32 years old, and I repair mobile phones for a living. I live in a small rented apartment above my workshop, in a quiet part of the city where people don't look at each other much. Most days, I wake up early, unlock the metal shutter, and spend hours fixing cracked screens, dead batteries, and phones that stopped working after someone dropped them one time too many. It's honest work, but lately it hasn't been enough to keep my mind quiet. The last year has been heavy. Business slowed down, rent went up, and I learned how easily people disappear when things get difficult. I stopped expecting much from anyone. I focused on work, on surviving, on getting through each day without falling further behind. I told myself that was enough. That morning started like any other. Rain outside, gray sky, the kind of day that feels unfinished. I had already repaired 3 phones, none of them paid well, and I was calculating numbers in my head, wondering how long I could keep the shop open. I was tired, distracted, and not expecting anything to change. The bell above the door rang softly. I looked up and saw her standing there, shaking rain from her coat, holding a phone that clearly wasn't working anymore. She hesitated, as if she wasn't sure she had come to the right place. I asked her what was wrong with the phone, using the same calm voice I used with every customer. She stepped closer to the counter, placed the phone down, and said it had stopped charging. That was all. Simple words. Nothing special. Then our eyes met. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't last long. Just a brief moment where neither of us spoke. But something shifted inside me. Not excitement. Not desire. Something quieter. Familiar, almost. Like recognizing a place you've never been, but somehow remember. I looked away first, uncomfortable with how strongly that moment had affected me. I picked up the phone, checked the port, asked routine questions. She answered politely, her voice steady but soft. I noticed she seemed tired, the kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying too much alone. While I worked, I felt her presence more than I usually feel customers. I was aware of her movements, the way she stood with her arms folded, the way she watched me without staring. When I finished inspecting the phone, I told her it would take about an hour. She nodded, smiled briefly, and said she would come back later. When the door closed behind her, the shop felt strangely empty. I stood there longer than necessary, holding her phone in my hand, aware that something had already changed, even though nothing had happened. I finished the repair carefully, slower than usual. My thoughts kept drifting back to her face, to that moment of silence. I told myself it meant nothing. People meet every day. Moments pass. But when she returned an hour later, the same feeling came back. She thanked me, paid, and asked how much longer I'd be open. I told her the usual hours. She hesitated again, then said she owned a small clothing shop 2 streets away and might need help with her phone settings another time. I nodded. I wanted to say more, but I didn't. Fear has a quiet voice, and I had learned to listen to it too well. After she left the second time, I couldn't focus anymore. I kept replaying that first glance, wondering why it stayed with me. I didn't know her name. I didn't know her story, but I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that I would never forget her. That night, lying in my apartment above the shop, listening to rain against the window, I realized how long it had been since someone had made me feel present in my own life. I didn't call it love. I didn't even call it hope. But I knew this was only the beginning, whether I wanted it or not. The next few days passed slower than usual. I tried to convince myself that nothing had happened, that a short moment of eye contact could not mean anything real. I focused on work, on phones, on small repairs that required patience and steady hands. Still, every time the bell above the door rang, I caught myself looking up too quickly, expecting to see her again. I didn't even know her name, and that bothered me more than it should have. On the 4th day, close to noon, she came back. I recognized her immediately, even before she stepped fully inside. Same coat, same quiet way of moving, same tired calm in her eyes. She smiled when she saw me, not a big smile, just enough to say she remembered me too. That alone made my chest tighten. She said her phone worked well, but she had trouble with some settings. She asked if I could help her for a few minutes. I told her to sit, and she did, placing her bag carefully beside the chair, like someone used to being responsible for everything she owns. As I adjusted the phone, we talked. Not about anything important at first, just small things. Weather, work, the street where my shop was located. I learned her name was Sarah. She owned a small clothing store nearby, something she had built herself over the years. She spoke about it without pride, more like a fact she carried with her. I told her about my work, about how I started repairing phones after leaving a larger repair chain because I wanted something of my own. I didn't tell her how close I was to losing it all. Some things felt too heavy for a first real conversation. There were moments of silence, but they didn't feel awkward. They felt natural, like pauses that didn't need to be filled. When I handed the phone back to her, our fingers touched briefly. It was nothing dramatic, but I felt it, and judging by the way she looked up at me, she felt it too. She thanked me again and asked if I ever took breaks. I said not often. She nodded, as if she understood more than I had said. Later that afternoon, I closed the shop earlier than usual and walked past her store. I didn't plan it. I told myself I was just going home, but my steps slowed when I saw the lights inside and her silhouette moving between clothing racks. I stood outside longer than I should have, then finally pushed the door open. She looked surprised, then smiled. A real smile this time. I said I was just passing by. She laughed quietly and said that was a strange coincidence. She showed me around the store, explaining which items sold well and which ones stayed untouched for months. I noticed how carefully she treated everything, like the store wasn't just a business, but a reflection of her life. She offered me a coffee from a small machine in the back. We stood there, leaning against the counter, drinking from mismatched cups. The conversation slowly became more personal. Not deep confessions, but honest fragments. She mentioned a past relationship that had ended badly. I said I understood more than she probably thought. When I left, it was already dark. I walked home feeling lighter, and that feeling scared me. Over the next weeks, we found reasons to see each other again. She came by with small questions about her phone. I stopped by her shop under the excuse of fixing the card reader or adjusting music settings. Sometimes we just talked. Sometimes we sat in silence, comfortable with not pretending. Still, neither of us crossed the line. There was caution in everything we did. We both carried past disappointments, and neither of us wanted to be the first to name what was growing between us. One evening, as I locked my shop, she appeared on the sidewalk. She said her store had been slow that day, and she didn't feel like going home yet. I suggested a walk. She agreed without hesitation. We walked through quiet streets, talking about childhood memories, about the strange paths that lead people where they are. At one point, she stopped and looked at me. Not quickly, not shyly. She said she felt like she had known me longer than she actually had. I didn't answer right away. Then I told her I felt the same, and that it confused me. She smiled, but there was sadness in it too. She said some connections come early, before people are ready for them. That night, after we said goodbye, I lay awake thinking about how easily she had entered my life, and how afraid I was of what that could mean. I knew then that this was no longer just a moment. It was becoming something I could not ignore, no matter how careful I tried to be. The closer Sarah and I got, the more I noticed how careful we both were. We could spend an hour talking like it was nothing, laughing quietly over a small misunderstanding. And then the moment the conversation drifted toward anything serious, we would both step back. Not because we didn't feel it, but because we did. I kept telling myself I was being smart. I'd been burned before. I knew what it looked like when hope showed up dressed as something real. Still, every time I walked into her store and saw her look up, the same calm certainty returned. It wasn't loud. It didn't demand anything. It simply existed. Then life reminded us that feelings don't pay rent. It started with a letter taped to my workshop door. I saw it when I arrived early one morning, coffee in hand, keys already between my fingers. The building owner had printed it out, signed it, and slid it under clear tape like it was a parking ticket. Rent increase. Effective next month. I read it twice, then a third time, as if the numbers might change. They didn't. My stomach tightened. I stood there on the sidewalk, watching cars pass, and felt something in me sink. I had barely been keeping up as it was. The last months were already a quiet battle of choosing which bills could wait and which couldn't. Inside the shop, I turned on the lights and sat at my workbench without opening any phones. I just stared at the small screws and tools, trying to think like a grown man, trying to find solutions instead of panic. The truth was simple. If the rent went up, I would not survive here. By midday, I called the owner. He sounded polite, almost bored. He said prices were going up everywhere, and he had other people interested in the space. He didn't threaten me directly. He didn't have to. The message was clear. That evening, I walked past Sarah's shop like I always did now. The lights were on, but the place looked empty. She was behind the counter, counting something, her shoulders tense. When she saw me, her face softened, but only for a second. The tiredness came back immediately after. I asked her if she was okay. She hesitated, then said it had been a bad week. A supplier delayed an order, another one raised prices, and 2 customers returned expensive items they had worn once and tried to claim were defective. She said it like she was reporting the weather, but I could hear the strain underneath. I didn't tell her about my rent letter. Not at first. I wanted to be the calm one, the steady one. But there was no point pretending. I said, "My rent is going up next month." She stopped what she was doing and looked at me. "How much?" I told her. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, and she exhaled slowly. She didn't say sorry. She didn't offer empty comfort. She just nodded, like she understood the weight of it. We didn't talk much after that. Not because we didn't want to, but because we both felt the same thing. We were standing on thin ice, and neither of us wanted to be the first to crack it. Over the next days, the pressure grew. I stayed longer at the shop, took every repair I could, even the small jobs that barely paid. I posted ads online. I called old customers. I tried to look confident when people came in, but the truth followed me like a shadow. Sarah began closing her store later too. She was trying to push sales, rearranging displays, offering small discounts, doing everything herself because she couldn't afford extra help. When I stopped by, I found her on a ladder changing a sign, her hair tied back, her hands shaking slightly from fatigue. I told her to get down and let me do it. She argued for half a second, then let me. When I finished, I turned and saw her watching me with that quiet expression she had when she didn't know what to say, but felt something anyway. It was the first time I realized how much I wanted to protect her. Not in a dramatic way, not as a hero, just this simple human desire to make someone's life lighter. But the more I wanted that, the more afraid I became. On a Friday evening, I received a message from a friend who had moved to a nearby city months earlier. He said a small electronics shop there needed someone who could repair phones. Steady work, decent pay. He asked if I was interested. I stared at the message for a long time. It felt like an escape route. It also felt like a betrayal, even though I had promised nothing to anyone. I hadn't built a future with Sarah. We hadn't said we were together. We had been careful. We had been cautious. That was the point, wasn't it? Still, the idea of leaving made my chest tighten. The next day, I went to Sarah's store with the excuse of checking her card reader again. The truth was I needed to see her. I needed to hear her voice and figure out if this connection was real enough to change my decisions. She was alone, folding sweaters with mechanical precision. When she saw me, she forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. I said, "You look exhausted." She shrugged. "It's fine. I'm used to it." I didn't like that answer. I didn't like how quickly she dismissed her own struggle. It sounded like something I used to tell myself. I stood there awkwardly for a moment, then said, "Can we talk? Not about phones." She paused, then nodded. She walked to the back and turned the sign on the door to closed. That simple action hit me harder than it should have. It meant she was choosing to give me time, even when she didn't have much to spare. We sat in the small back area again, the same place where we had drunk coffee weeks earlier. This time neither of us reached for cups. We just sat, listening to the quiet hum of the store lights. I told her about the rent increase. I told her about the message from my friend. I admitted that I was thinking about leaving because I didn't know what else to do. Sarah listened without interrupting. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. When I finished, she looked down for a moment, then back up at me. "Are you telling me because you want my opinion?" she asked, "or because you're saying goodbye?" The question was direct, and it made my throat tighten. "I don't know," I admitted. "I hate that I don't know." She nodded slowly. "I understand. I've been close to closing this store more times than I want to admit." I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that. I had been picturing her as stronger than me, more stable, someone who had it together. Hearing her say she was struggling too didn't make her smaller. It made her real. She continued, quieter now. "I'm scared too, Oscar. Not just about money. About everything." I looked at her. "About what?" She hesitated, then said, "About letting someone matter again. About building something and then losing it." I don't trust quick feelings. But with you, it didn't feel quick. It felt immediate, like my body knew before my head could argue. The words landed in my chest like a weight and a relief at the same time. I swallowed. That first day, when you came into my shop, I haven't been the same since. Her eyes softened. Me neither. We sat in silence, and for the first time it didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like honesty settling in. I said, I'm not asking you to fix this. I'm not asking you to save me. I don't want to disappear without telling you the truth. Sarah's voice was calm, but her eyes were wet. What's the truth? I took a breath. The truth is I don't want to leave if it means losing you before we even started. And I don't know what to do with that. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, I can't promise anything will be easy. I can't promise I won't be afraid. But I don't want to lose this either. That was the closest thing to a confession either of us could manage. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't perfect. It was real. When I stood up to leave, she followed me to the front of the store. At the door, we paused again, that familiar moment of silence between us. This time I didn't look away first. I said, can we take it one step at a time? Sarah nodded. Yes. I walked back to my shop with my mind still heavy, but my chest less empty. The problems were still there. The rent, the bills, the uncertainty. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't carrying it alone. And I knew something else too. Whatever happened next, we had crossed a line we couldn't uncross. We had finally said enough to make it real. After that evening, something between Sarah and me shifted into a quieter place. We didn't suddenly become fearless or confident. Nothing turned easy overnight. But we stopped pretending that what we felt could be ignored. We began to show up for each other in small, practical ways, the kind that matter most when life feels unstable. The next morning, Sarah came to my workshop before opening her store. She brought 2 coffees and placed one next to my tools without saying much. She looked tired, but determined. I thanked her, and she said she had a long day ahead. Before leaving, she paused and asked if I could stop by later to look at her computer system. It had been freezing again. I said yes without hesitation. That became our rhythm. No big promises, no dramatic declarations. Just presence. I helped her with technical issues at the store, sometimes staying late to make sure everything worked before the next day. She helped me in ways I hadn't expected. She started recommending my repair shop to her customers, not loudly, not like an advertisement, but honestly. She trusted my work, and that trust reached people faster than any sign in the window. One afternoon, she came to my shop carrying a small notebook. She sat across from me and asked how much I needed each month just to stay open. I hesitated, then told her. She wrote the number down, nodded, and said nothing else. It wasn't pity. It wasn't pressure. It felt like someone standing beside me instead of in front of me. A few days later, she showed me her own numbers. Rent, suppliers, slow weeks, returns. She didn't hide the struggle. Seeing it laid out like that made me realize how similar we were. Different work, same weight. We didn't talk about moving in together. We didn't talk about the future in big words. We talked about tomorrow. About what could be done now. There were moments when fear returned. Moments when I caught myself pulling back, worried that I would fail her. Moments when she grew quiet, clearly fighting old doubts. But instead of retreating into silence like before, we spoke about it. Not perfectly, but honestly. One evening, after closing both our shops, we walked together through the neighborhood. The streets were calm, lights reflecting on wet pavement. She told me she had spent years building her store after a painful breakup, afraid that depending on anyone would mean losing herself. I told her how fixing phones had started as a way to avoid people, a job where broken things made sense. She stopped walking and looked at me. She said she didn't want to be saved, and she didn't want to save me. She just wanted to stand next to someone who stayed. I told her that was exactly what I wanted too. The first time I stayed the night at her place wasn't planned. We talked late, sitting on her couch, sharing food from takeout containers. When it got too late to walk home, she offered the spare blanket without hesitation. There was no rush, no pressure, just comfort. I slept better than I had in months. From then on, we shared more space, slowly. Mornings before opening our shops. Evenings after long days. We learned each other's habits, small annoyances, quiet strengths. It wasn't ideal or polished. It was real. The message from my friend about the job offer stayed unanswered. Not because everything was solved, but because for the first time, I wanted to try staying. I spoke to my landlord again, negotiated more firmly, bought myself time. It wasn't a victory, but it was a step. Sarah stood beside me through it, not fixing the problem, but reminding me why I was fighting. One night, as we locked up her store together, she took my hand. Not suddenly, not nervously, just naturally. I realized then that choosing each other wasn't about dramatic decisions. It was about continuing to choose, even when fear whispered louder. For the first time, the future didn't feel like a threat. It felt like something we were walking toward together. Time did not suddenly become generous after Sarah and I chose each other. Life stayed demanding, practical, and sometimes exhausting. But the difference was simple and powerful. We stopped facing it alone. 2 months after the rent increase notice, I signed a new agreement with the landlord. The conditions were still tight, but manageable. I added tablet repairs and data recovery to my services, worked longer hours, and slowly, the numbers began to stabilize. Not perfectly, but enough to breathe again. Sarah's store survived its hardest season too. She adjusted her inventory, focused on fewer pieces, better quality, and built stronger relationships with regular customers. Some days were slow, but others surprised her. When she smiled behind the counter again, it wasn't forced anymore. We moved carefully, but forward. Eventually, my apartment above the shop no longer made sense. Too small. Too lonely. One evening, while washing dishes at Sarah's place, she looked at me and said it simply. "You don't have to go back tonight." I didn't. Moving in together wasn't a dramatic decision. It happened through toothbrushes left behind, clothes folded into shared drawers, keys exchanged without ceremony. We talked about expectations, about money, about space. There were disagreements, small tensions, moments of silence. But there was no running away. A year passed. One evening, after closing our shops, we walked the same streets where we had once avoided naming what we felt. We stopped near my old workshop door, now painted fresh, the sign clean and steady. Sarah leaned against me and asked if I ever thought about that first day. I said I did, more often than I admitted. I told her that moment scared me because it felt too right too fast. She said it scared her too, because it felt like something that could change everything. We stood there quietly, remembering how fragile we both were back then. That night, at home, I asked her to sit with me at the table. I didn't kneel. I didn't rehearse a speech. I told her the truth. I said I wanted a life with her that stayed honest, even when it got hard. I said I wanted to wake up next to her even on bad days. I said I didn't believe in perfect love, but I believed in choosing her every day. She didn't cry. She didn't laugh. She just nodded and said yes. We married quietly 6 months later. No crowd. No noise. Just a small room, a few people who mattered, and promises spoken clearly. Sarah wore a simple dress from her own store. I wore a jacket I had fixed myself after tearing the lining. It felt right. Years later, the shop doors still open every morning. Her store grew into a second location. My repair business became stable enough to hire help. Life stayed real. Bills still arrived. Problems still showed up. But every evening, when I lock the door and see Sarah waiting for me across the street, I remember that first moment. The brief meeting of eyes. The quiet certainty. It wasn't magic. It was recognition. And it lasted.